Hello, I'm Dr. Simeon Roger, and this is another in our series of videos on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Victory Day and the duct tape of lies. Yesterday, I came across a rather insightful comment left by someone who had watched a video about the latest Russian propaganda surrounding the invasion. The comment was simply this: "Every day," he said, "we're learning that Russia is a nation whose fabric is held together by lies." May the 9th in Russia is referred to as День Великой Победы, literally the day of the great victory. And as every year, there will be a huge military parade in Red Square in celebration of the victory over Nazi Germany, just like the first one you're seeing here in May 1945. There's only one small problem, though. To celebrate Russia's Victory Day, you either have to swallow a very simplistic and whitewashed version of history, or deliberately ignore much of what really happened. You see, Victory Day is all about the victory of Stalin's Russia over Hitler's Germany. Unfortunately, since Stalin butchered something like 8.5 million of his own people outside of wartime, this could hardly be considered a moral victory. As the quintessential terror state, it's not surprising that so many Soviet soldiers actually defected to the Germans, at least 250,000 of them. In fact, probably quite a bit more. Now, growing up, I was privileged to know a great many people who lived through this conflict, and the conflict on the Eastern Front was one of unimaginable horror. Worse than that, it forced everyone involved to make a very, very difficult choice: either support the invader in hopes of being freed from Stalin's tyranny, or support the tyrant you hate in order to stave off ethnic annihilation at the hands of Hitler's SS. And I knew people who came down on different sides of that choice, and knowing the historical circumstances, it was difficult to judge any of them. The other issue they'll never fail to, or they will fail to tell you about on the Victory Day celebration, is the degree to which Stalin himself was directly responsible for Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. When the paranoid dictator executed most of the senior officer corps of the Red Army for supposed disloyalty during the 1930s, he set up the Soviet military for inevitable failure in any upcoming conflict. And in the 1939 invasion of Finland, this is exactly what happened. Humiliated by their much smaller and weaker neighbor, the Red Army's weaknesses lay exposed for everyone to see. And naturally, the first person to take notice of this was none other than Adolf Hitler, who, emboldened by the Soviets' operational incompetence, went forward with his own plans to invade the USSR, an invasion that would cost, of course, well over 20 million lives. And finally, it's important to note that Stalin had more than enough warning of Hitler's intention to invade the Soviet Union. He was told by his own intelligence in Europe, his own intelligence in Japan, who you see here, as well as his own military intelligence, and yet he wouldn't hear of it. And keep in mind that no one wanted to bring Stalin news he didn't want to hear. That's what we would now refer to as a career-limiting move. What's even more ironic, and most people in the West don't realize this at all, was that Stalin himself had every intention of invading Nazi Germany. He was hardly the innocent victim here. Now, when I first came across that theory, I admit I wasn't so sure, so I asked someone who was actually there at the time, someone who was partly responsible for building the railway network in Ukraine that would have been necessary as the groundwork for such an invasion. When I asked him if Stalin really had such a plan, his eyes lit up and he said to me in Russian, "Oh, da, plan был." Yes, there was a plan. It's just that Hitler was ready about 2 years before Stalin could possibly have been. And if you're a connoisseur of Victory Day, you'll undoubtedly hear of the great prowess of the Red Army during the war and how they defeated the Germans. What they won't tell you is that driving the German armies out was based almost entirely on brute force rather than skill, on overwhelming numbers, and on the fact that Germany was running out of resources because it was fighting on too many fronts, and because its means of military production were under continuous bombing from the Western Allies. The truth is that man for man and unit for unit, the German Wehrmacht was far superior to the Soviet army throughout the entire war. They had a much more flexible command structure, better tactics, superior morale, and they were not laboring under the debilitating psychological handicaps that afflicted the Red Army, which we'll get to in just a moment. And finally, and perhaps most damning of all, they'll never tell you during Victory Day that all those heroes of the Great Patriotic War that they're extolling, if they were taken prisoner by the Germans, they were immediately sent by Stalin straight to the Gulag after the war, where they would languish for the next 10 years. Such was the paranoia of the dictator, who suspected everyone who surrendered of treason, even if their surrender was the direct result of his own paranoid purge of the officer corps, his refusal to accept the analysis of his intelligence people, or his endless interference in the conduct of the war. The obvious retort to these criticisms of Victory Day is that all countries have a dark past, and that they certainly don't want to look at that dark past while celebrating their Independence Day or other defining historical moment. Fair enough. However, whereas we in the West are free to investigate the deep, dark pasts of our own countries, and we do so with relish, it is now illegal in Putin's Russia to question the role of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War. In other words, pretty much everything I'm talking about here is off limits in the educational curriculum, in academia, or in any official discussion. And I wouldn't recommend talking about it on your YouTube channel if you're living in Russia. Another thing that few people realize, and it should receive much more attention, is the almost surreal psychological dysfunction that was rife in the Soviet Union of the time and which still afflicts modern Russia today. A close friend of my family was from Serbia, yet he fought in the Soviet army as an officer during the war from the Battle of Stalingrad onward. His name was Alex, and his stories, corroborated by those of many other witnesses, are nothing short of jaw-dropping. However, honestly, adjectives like surreal and jaw-dropping hardly begin to communicate the level of insanity involved. So one day, Alex came back from the front, and he was told that some of his fellow officers had been arrested by the dreaded NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and that they were being held in a house not too far behind the front lines. Fortunately, Alex was all too well aware of something that the great Soviet writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn would later mention, which is the difference between the Soviet NKVD and Hitler's Gestapo. That the Gestapo was fine with releasing a suspect if he was not a threat. Once you were in the clutches of the Soviet NKVD, though, they would never let you go, whether you were guilty or not. Armed with this knowledge, this former Soviet officer I knew took some of his other men and armed them all with captured German weapons. They then proceeded to the house where their friends were being held. They shot all the NKVD officers and freed their own men. Then they wrote a report to headquarters saying that the NKVD post had unfortunately been overrun by the Germans. In a similar incident, he returned from the front again, only to discover that a Smersh officer had recently come to his command post looking for him. Now, Smersh was the Soviet Army's wartime counterintelligence unit and had exactly the same reputation as the NKVD. In fact, its name is an acronym for the words death to spies. And that's why Alex discovered upon his return that his own officers had in fact already shot the Smersh officer and his driver just to keep their beloved commander safe. As Alex himself put it, he and his fellow officers in the brigade he was commanding only really spent about 50% of their time and energy fighting the Germans. The other 50% had to be devoted to fighting the NKVD and Smersh because of the insane paranoia that permeated the Soviet system. And of course, one of the main roles of the NKVD troops during the war was to shoot Russian soldiers who were tempted to retreat. You'll notice we see the same thing now in Ukraine, except it's now the Chechens who have this role, apparently. And Stalin had a great many Soviet generals, of course, shot for their failures, just as Putin is predictably purging his own senior military and intelligence leaders for his own stupidity, such as General Sergei Beseda of the FSB or Admiral Igor Osipov, commander of the Black Sea Fleet. And that constant paranoia about spies and traitors in their midst that nearly paralyzed the Red Army at times during the war was all too evident in Putin's recent speech, where he condemned Russians who had decided to leave the country as a westernized fifth column, and in which he called upon Russians to cleanse Russian society of such people. This has predictably led to a wave of denunciations in modern Russian society, of ordinary Russians turning in other Russians to the FSB as alleged opponents of Putin's special military operation. It seems that during the many long centuries of its history, Muscovy has never changed. Whether under the guise of a city-state, the Russian Empire, the USSR, or the modern Russian Federation, it's the same inflexible hierarchical structure, the same unquestioning obedience to the person at the top, the same brutal methods used on friend and foe alike by a regime that cares nothing for the welfare of its own people, whom it uses as cannon fodder. Like the Soviet state before it, Putin's Russia has spared no expense in the effort to scare its potential enemies into submission. Indeed, no one puts out more propaganda about the sophistication and lethality of its military's weapon systems than does Russia. If the saying is true that little dogs bark but big ones don't have to, then it's no surprise to find out that much of this propaganda has proven incredibly exaggerated. Unfortunately, though, this kind of propaganda also has a downside for the user. Because at times the Russians have kept their best technology secret rather than trying to scare foreign enemies with it. Hence, Hitler was not deterred at all by the existence of the Soviet Union's powerful T-34 and KV-1 tanks because he didn't know about them. They were, after all, state secrets. There's no doubt the Great Patriotic War and its 20 million plus casualties have inflicted a devastating trauma on the Russian people. Unfortunately for those apologists who use this trauma as an excuse for Russia's bad behavior on the international stage, saying that the West should give in to Russia's so-called security concerns, that argument holds no water. You see, it's easy to argue that the people of Ukraine and Belarus suffered even more during the Great Patriotic War, trapped between an invader from the West who initially promised liberation and whose genocidal agenda only became evident over time, and the foreign tyrant from Moscow. The peoples of Ukraine and Belarus were in a definite no-win situation. And many of the bloodiest battles, after all, were fought on their territory. Are they traumatized? Of course they are. Any civilization or culture would be after such an event. And the scars of that trauma will still be there within that culture even after nearly 80 years. But do the people of Ukraine go about threatening their neighbors and plotting against them? No. Which is all the proof anyone should need that past trauma doesn't justify current behavior. One thing conspicuously absent from the Victory Day celebrations today, as during Soviet times, is any mention of Lendlease, the program under which the Allies supplied an enormous amount of military equipment to the Soviet Union, including some 7,000 tanks, 13,000 aircraft, nearly 2,000 railway locomotives, along with nearly 500,000 other vehicles. That aid was supplied in good faith. However, that good faith, as we know from history, was never reciprocated. One could argue that Stalin's personal paranoia was to blame for this. However, the xenophobia and distrust that have historically permeated Muscovite culture can no longer be overlooked. In the Muscovite narrative, which became the Soviet narrative and modern Russia's narrative, Russia is always the victim, surrounded by its malevolent enemies. Yet though it's the victim, it is somehow also paradoxically mighty and to be feared. Moreover, Russia demands respect, a respect that is always based on fear. Because of this, Russia of today is trying to recover its old buffer states. In other words, it must control the nations around it in order to feel secure. Little wonder then that Russia's paranoid xenophobia is indistinguishable from aggressive imperialism. A Russia based on the Muscovite narrative will always be a threat to the peace and security of its neighbors. By engaging in a war he cannot win, Putin has laid bare Russia's military weaknesses for everyone to see. Like so many dictators tempted into radical overreach, he has single-handedly undone the effects of years of his own propaganda and planning. Finland and Sweden are highly likely to join NATO. This will actually more than double the amount of NATO territory bordering on Russia directly, and NATO will be forced to forward deploy more and more troops to its eastern regions. So while Putin faced very little NATO military power anywhere near Russian territory prior to the war, he will now have to face quite a lot of it. He has single-handedly reinvigorated NATO and the transatlantic alliance in general, as well as transforming the Russian economy into a ticking time bomb, thanks to Western sanctions whose severity he did not anticipate. Most importantly of all, though, Putin has united the people of Ukraine, including its Russian speakers, in a way no one would have dreamed possible. In fact, he's handed them a great gift, wrapped though it is in the tragedy of war. He has handed Ukraine its founding national mythos, which forevermore will be thought of as their final freedom from Muscovite domination. In other words, Putin has given Ukraine a true Great Patriotic War. And unlike the so-called Great Patriotic War of the mid-20th century, this one is morally unambiguous and has none of the sordid underbelly of the old one. Should it even survive as a nation, Putin's Russia will continue to be held together by the duct tape of its own lies and half-truths, at least until the current regime has fallen and its Russian imperial ideology has been finally repudiated. You could say that Putin has accomplished his legacy of being unforgettable to history, though not at all in the way he would have imagined. I'm Dr. Simeon Roger for the Leader Revolution. Thanks for watching. Stay strong, support Ukraine and relief efforts any way you can, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.